Advance.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And then we'll go to questions.
Are you okay with recording this, or is it?
I'm fine.
Shall we start?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the link.
All right. So welcome to the BIRC Speaker Series. It's a great pleasure to welcome the Department Chair of Psychiatry from UConn Health. I'm going to read my little cheat sheet because he has a lot. So Professor David Steffens is a Samuel, you have to help me here, Samuel Sy Birnbaum, Ida, Louise, and Richard Blum Chair in Psychiatry. Did I get it right?
Yes.
Okay, this is why I needed this printout. In Psychiatry and Department Chair of Psychiatry at UConn Health since 2012. Prior to this position, he was at Duke University School of Medicine for more than 20 years, where he had served as a professor of psychiatry, vice chair for education. So he mentored a lot of students as well as residents and fellows and junior faculty, and division chief of geriatric psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke. He's the past president of the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry, and has authored more than 300 peer-reviewed papers. Seems unimaginable, and is the co-editor of the leading textbook in geriatric psychiatry. Dr. Steffens also has considerable experience in medical education and mentoring, and he's a graduate of Rice University, so apparently he studied biochemistry in Spanish. Have you given talks in Spanish?
I have.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
And the University of Texas Houston Health Science Center School of Medicine. Dr. Steffens then moved to Duke in 1988, where he completed his internship and residency in psychiatry. And since joining Duke faculty and now at UConn Health, Dr. Steffens' career has focused on mood and cognitive disorders in older adults, and particularly using a lot of neuroimaging. His major area of research focuses on links between depression in later life and development of cognitive decline and dementia. And Dr. Steffens has been continuously supported by NIH for over 20 years, often with multiple R1s, and using a lot of neuroimaging with web tips also on that. And at UConn, Dr. Steffens is continuing to research pursuits with a new NIMH supported study known as NBOLD. I assume that's related to neuroimaging, bold effects in neuroimaging, that examines the relationship between stress and depression in older adults. So today we're very fortunate to have him give a talk to us with the title of Linking Late Depression, Cognitive Impairment, and Dementia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Steffens.
Thank you very much for your time. It's great to be here. I was, I think, here at the dawn of the BIRC. I remember Jay and Pete sort of gave me a tour of the way things were going to be, and obviously it's awesome, something quite remarkable. So it is great to be back. So this is an executive function test, which I'm failing. So if I just keep randomly pushing buttons,
Yeah, you might want to elect to use the keyboard because I
don't know
if that's cool.
Very good. Funding here. You know, we're going to be talking some about late life depression, particularly the epidemiologic literature, which sort of got me interested in this topic before sort of bringing it down to a clinical level, and then thinking about neuropsychological and neuroimaging factors related to increased risk of cognitive decline. And then my latest project looking at the role of neuroticism in depression, which is a new area for me. So, you know, for our bread and butter in geriatric psychiatry is often a referral of a patient with some degree of mood disorder and some degree of cognitive complaint, and this, you know, is this depression or is this dementia? And the answer, of course, is yes. And then we try to sort of sort through, is it one or the other, or is there a little bit of both? So these are very common in the clinical world. Then looking at thinking about depression and later dementia, there's a lot of studies from the 80s into the 90s that focused on a history of depression being associated with later evidence of cognitive decline and ultimately Alzheimer's disease. One of the notions is, if it happens in fairly short order, perhaps depression may be a prodrome of Alzheimer's disease. And in one epidemiologic study that I was involved with, indeed, the closer you got between onset of depression and onset of dementia, the higher the risk ratio, so that there was a 1-year difference versus 2-year, and then at some point it sort of starts losing statistical significance. But it appears, at least for some people, that the depression is sort of the tip of a really bad neuropsychiatric iceberg, and that what is lurking there is probably a neurodegenerative type illness that could be Alzheimer's disease. And so several other studies sort of looked at this notion that there may be a transition period where you have depression, but you have cognitive impairment, and then go on to develop some kind of a dementia, Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. A fair amount of studies in the 80s and 90s looked at that as well. Sort of begs the question, is there something about depression only in late life? What about studies that might have looked at depression earlier on, let's say in middle life? And in fact, there is some epidemiologic evidence that depressive symptoms that occurred even more than 10 years before onset of dementia were related to dementia, so that there seems to be sort of a dose of depression, at least in middle life or later life, may be related to an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. So I know that I've fascinated you by this, and if you really want to look at a really nice, easily digested review article, that one was done, oh gosh, nearing 20 years ago now. This was very current when I started putting this talk together, which is now probably in its 15th or 16th year, looking at this sort of systematic review at that time, looking at 7 case control studies, finding about a doubling of risk, and as well as some prospective studies as well. Yes.
Would you like to save the questions until
the end? I'm happy to be interrupted.
Okay, so I was wondering if having a depression earlier in life is related to severity or certain types of kind of subtype of Alzheimer's or certain characteristics when you have Alzheimer's in terms of symptoms. Is there any difference between those with depression as a risk factor versus other kind of risk factors that leads to Alzheimer's? Is there some kind of symptomatic or phenotypic differences? And the reason why I ask this is there's, for example, if you look at a certain kind of dementia, for example, the logopenic subtype that has more phonological deficits, and if you look back, there seems to be more links to language-based learning disabilities, for example. So I'm just curious if there's more kind of that.
So not a lot done in terms of early to midlife types of depression and how it looks. I would say that the bulk of the literature has been this sort of late onset depression that can lead to a cognitive decline and a dementia picture, and we'll get into what that picture might look like. But one of the hallmarks of this late onset depression is less sort of the boohoo type of depression, less of a mood experience and much more of an apathetic picture. And it's thought that that may be related to vascular disease. And then that can carry through into the presentation of the dementia picture that can look more influenced by vascular disease. So days of acute confusion or ups and downs in terms of cognition, as opposed to a more slow, insidious progress. I don't think any of because you would have to do these through epidemiologic studies as opposed to prospective, 40-year studies. I don't think any of the epidemiologic studies have linked that to a particular, like midlife depression, to a particular subtype of dementia. They just sort of globally called it dementia or Alzheimer's disease. In this review, basically said, well, there may be a few reasons why there may be this link between depression and dementia. It could be depression could be part of a prodrome, or it could be because when you're depressed, there are cognitive symptoms of depression. You don't concentrate as well, you don't multitask as well, you may not be laying down good memories, and that in itself, if you sort of have this predisposition to get demented, throwing a depression on there may cause this clinical manifestation. And then there's this other intriguing, and this sort of gets into this midlife kind of depression, that sort of depression as a stressor. And this comes from the PTSD literature in rodents and in combat veterans, showing that depression being a sort of acute stress associated with cortisol, circulating glucocorticoids, being neurotoxic, particularly to the hippocampus, so that there may be something where you've taken a hit to your hippocampus, and that in itself may help. If you're sort of genetically destined to get Alzheimer's disease, a hit to your hippocampus may bring out those manifestations of cognitive decline as well. So this is a very thoughtful piece in terms of things that one might think about in thinking about the relationship between depression and cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. So sort of a lot of my research, the way I think about research for me is to bring it to sort of clinical reality, and how do the questions that we ask and try to answer have anything to do with what's out there in the real world. So first, depression symptoms are common, as is cognitive impairment, short of dementia. Little is known about the prevalence of co-occurring depression and cognitive impairment, and even less known about their individual or combined effect on risk for dementia. At that point in 2004, 2005, NIMH put together a group of people that usually don't sit in the same room, and that's people who study late life depression, and primarily from the neurology research, those studying mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And basically it said, you need to talk to each other more, inform each other's research a bit more. For a lot of the mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's studies, depression was an absolute exclusion. And they were also saying, you all in the depression world really don't characterize cognition that well. And so given that these are two common conditions that often may co-occur and may have additive risk in terms of development of dementia, we need more of this. So that was this sort of white paper came out of that, that meeting. We do know from some studies that depression and cognitive impairment do coexist. This one ARV article that is now almost 20 years old, looking at sort of this combined combination of impaired cognition and depressive symptoms, estimated that it doubles, so that by the time you're 85, about 25% will have significant depressive symptoms and significant cognitive impairment. From the mild cognitive impairment side of things, then some studies then started looking at depressive symptoms and found that in a population with mild cognitive impairment, conditions thought to be midway between normal cognition and Alzheimer's disease, you sort of then look for what are the risks of flipping into full-blown dementia, and found that depression is sort of doubling. It seems to be a recurring theme here. Sort of those with depression and MCI had twice the risk of dementia compared to those without depression. Interestingly, this was highest for vascular dementia. So NCODE represents a weekend of me obsessing about a really cool acronym for a study. So this was a study. So part of research and doing well in research is just being in the right place at the right time and being willing to work hard. So this study, funded in 1995, I'd just come on staff. They were looking for a junior faculty member to be on the study to start following patients. And then lo and behold, the Barney Carroll, who just passed away this year, actually decided to leave Duke, and to this very eager, enterprising young faculty member gave an RL1. And so, thank you. So then I took that out, and this was a study primarily looking at imaging as it predicted mood changes over time in depression. So I was able to adapt it to include a cognitive piece as well, and then in subsequent iterations was able to continue to follow these folks. And I was still following some of these folks when I left Duke in 2012. So, almost 20 years of following some people. And to get in, basically depressed, being willing to get an MRI scan and to get get cognitive assessments at a later iteration. We partnered with our Alzheimer's Disease Center and actually included an autopsy component, because they start sadly getting that age where they're at risk for dying as well. So this was a study that had a lot of moving parts to it, and really looking at cognitive decline in those with late life depression and healthy controls. Looking at longitudinal MRI changes, eventually wanted to look at genetic influences as well. There's a strong literature linking late onset depression, late life depression with cerebrovascular disease. And this notion of a vascular depression was coined by folks both at Duke and our counterparts in Cornell. And one of the things we found was that those who developed dementia had more of a change in white matter burden over 2 years. So we'd get baseline and 2-year MRI scans looking at a variety of things, but clearly there was something about worsening cognitive impairment and worsening vascular disease on scans. We were looking at Alzheimer's disease. Let's think about the hippocampus, basically finding something similar. The change in hippocampal volume. One, there's something about being depressed and what that does to the hippocampus. We found at baseline, people who with late life depression tended to have smaller hippocampi compared to the age-matched controls without depression. But also wanting to think about, does change in hippocampal volume then subsequently predict cognitive decline? And as many of you know, the mini mental state examination, very crude, almost a screening tool for Alzheimer's disease, 30 items. But it was something that we got on a very regular basis. And we were basically able to show that change in hippocampal volume then predicted cognitive decline. So, which sort of makes sense that you have a shrinking hippocampus and that it's going to have cognitive. So it's not rocket science, but it's my science. So nobody, people before in trying to understand the biological basis of depression, clearly the hippocampus is involved with that, both at baseline, but also because there appear to be ongoing effects in terms of hippocampal change and atrophy that have real life cognitive consequences as well.
One more question.
One more.
Maybe
Make a
more
good one.
It's not a particularly
Yes.
good one, but mini mental state exam, I know it's an overall sort of crude measure, as you said, but has there been research, and maybe there's a lot of it, maybe there's none, but that people, cognitive neuroscientists or cognitive psychologists, has correlated what that is constitutes of, for example, is it related to executive function or cognitive flexibility most, or is it, have people looked at more of the more kind of
Yes.
precise cognitive processes and
Yes.
how it relates?
And in fact, we have. So we got we basically got the MMSE every 6 months just to sort of do a check, because part of it was a human subjects issue of, because we knew this was at risk for Alzheimer's. We needed to make sure that we were documenting that people could still consent to be in the study. But along the way, it got us a lot of data. The downside of the MMSE, it is heavily memory focused because it's primarily a screen for Alzheimer's. So it does a pretty cruddy job in terms of executive impairment, that kind of thing. We did the consortium to establish a registry for Alzheimer's disease, the CIRAD, that was put together by the National Institute on Aging when they put together the Alzheimer's disease research centers. This group got together for clinical assessments, but also put together a standardized cognitive battery that included a wide variety of measures. We use that in part because so we could have comparisons with folks in our Alzheimer's center. We have some comparisons, but because it was also more Alzheimer-y focused, had a few executive measures, we added some in particular. So this is a long way of saying that one of the things that we have found was that executive impairment is particularly important and affected in addition to memory. People tend to make a lot of perseverative errors. Tell me all the animals you can think of in a minute, or all the words that start with the letter L, that kind of thing. They will tend to make more perseverative errors, and so there's that, which makes sense because frontal lobe is affected as well. But as I'll get to it, there's also definite memory impairment as well. This is sort of, so we have, you can have cognitive impairment, and it can lead to Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. It can lead to all sorts of other things. It can get better, but this is to basically boil down a construct for you. Vascular disease and neurodegenerative processes can both lead to cognitive impairment. Complicating the picture, cerebrovascular disease can also lead to depression. And then, this is what we see clinically, an older person with depression and some kind of cognitive impairment. So we need to think about whether there may be an underlying vascular disease process, an underlying neurodegenerative process, and to follow them because they may be at risk for Alzheimer's or for vascular depression. Let's say, so cognitive impairment, there are many domains of cognition, obviously. So let's think about memory impairment, for example. So that might mean that there's a neurodegenerative process leading to depression and memory impairment that then can lead to Alzheimer's disease. So thinking about memory impairment and depression, this was, again, not usually when people have thought about cognitive impairment of depression, they think about slow speed of processing, difficulty concentrating, sort of dysexecutive difficulty with multitasking, sequencing, that kind of thing, and less so about memory. And that's sort of in depression across the age spectrum. When you think about, though, with older adults and this connection with Alzheimer's disease, we thought it would be important to look at depression. So we borrowed from the mild cognitive impairment literature. We basically said, let's get, this is the battery that we did. Some of them are immediate delay, and some of them are sort of immediate memory, and some are more delayed. But this is what we happened to pull together. And the Mild cognitive impairment literature said basically 2 tests. Let's say you bomb out on 2 tests, that is score below 1.5 standard deviations, then we're going to call you, in our homegrown kind of way, mild cognitive impairment of depression. So you get a label yes, no. And we found that 1 year later, so you come into the study, you meet with our great study psychiatrists who are going to be trying very hard to get you undepressed, usually through pharmacologic management, medications. So we got this subgroup of folks who came in depressed, were not depressed at 1 year. Some of them met criteria for MCI at baseline. Some of them didn't. And basically the odds ratio of 4, so a huge risk of remaining in this mild cognitive impairment category at 1 year, despite the fact that you're no longer depressed. So depression is not, presence of depression is no longer clouding the issue. This is bad news. This is because we would like to say, well, all of this cognitive complaints and whatever we're finding, that's all related to depression. We treat your depression and everything gets better. And this is one piece of bad news, that memory impairment may very likely persist despite treatment. And that's not good. And then following people out even further, this presence of this amnestic MCI during active depression increased dementia risk relative to not having this MCI over 6 years. And so not only does the MCI persist, but mild cognitive impairment in the context of depression predicted subsequent Alzheimer's disease. So that's not good. And then sort of picture worth 1,000 words, presence of this and risk of dementia as well. So thinking about it, this is very crude. You sort of have this cerebrovascular disease, you get these frontal hits, and you might have this sort of picture of vascular dementia, a neurodegenerative process that might have the cognitive impairment, may be more memory or amnestic focused, and you can get AD. That is a artificial separation. The joy of working with older folks and doing this research is it is deliciously messy. This is what we have. We have these folks with this moderate to severe depression who have some memory complaints, and then we do testing. They have memory impairment, they have executive impairment, and in these folks, what we are worried about is probably a picture of neurodegenerative disease, and oh, by the way, they have really ratty looking brains from the standpoint of cerebrovascular disease. So you have sort of superimposed on this sort of Alzheimer-y decline, you have cerebrovascular disease. So you ride the roller coaster, good days, bad days, acute periods of confusion, sudden drops if they get a big hit in their brain. So a lot of these folks will have poorly treated hypertension, for example. And so it's a very messy picture. And that's kind of what we see clinically and what we need to worry about when we first evaluate folks with this constellation of mood and cognitive symptoms. So Fumiko wondered about MBOLD. So this actually less than a day's worth of obsessing about a subsequent acronym. So this was, instead of neurocognitive outcomes of depression, the LD NCODE, just generic neurobiology of late life depression. So that gets you to MBOLD. It just so happens to include functional imaging. This is one I wrote in 2011, submitted, then started looking around at chair jobs. It ends up getting a really good score. And I went, oh, well, I've just signed on to come to UConn, so I guess we're gonna do this. So Duke had to be gracious enough to relinquish the grant to allow me to get it going and get started here. And I was actually able to do that. I started in July, and the grant was moved by September, which is moving heaven and earth. I think it had something to do with me being the incoming chair, and they were, wanting to be. But so it is possible. It is possible for anybody coming from perhaps a different institution recently. It is theoretically possible to move grants. This one was easier because it actually hadn't started. I don't know why I'm looking at you, but the whole grantsmanship and all of the politics of grants is just another, there's something they don't really teach you. They don't really teach you all, but it's something that is for many. I have seen grants where the institution was so pissed off at somebody for leaving, they refused to relinquish the grant. It's because these are grants to institutions, not to individual investigators. So it's that whole, yes, the politics of grantsmanship is something that I think you only learn usually over beer somewhere, where people tell their sad stories. But it's an interesting part of my experience that I fortunately was able to move this without too much trouble. So this was with my what time is it? We have time, plenty of time. Yes, my Fitbit watch was running low, so I decided to charge it this morning, and then went off and forgot it. The rationale for this grant: late life depression, cognitive impairment, serious public health concerns, all the things you have to write for a grant. So part of this is literally cutting and pasting from my grant. So this is also a lesson on grantsmanship here. Neuroticism is a complex construct that I tried to convey in the grant that has public health significance that may benefit from a neuroscience approach. The way I wrote this was much more folksy, talking to people like we often use neurotic, that patient is neurotic for those who don't show up or don't respond to our initial. It's a pejorative, and yet it's likely if we think about it, presence of neuroticism is common across the life cycle. It's understudied, and can we sort of disaggregate it and apply a neuroscience type approach to it? So that was, this is like one of the funnest grants that I've written, that also got one of its best scores. I think because people knew what I was talking about. The clinician researchers on the study section, I think, got it. So, neuroticism as a construct, ISANC, Costa and others have sort of come up with neuroticism. It's basically this tendency towards. So it's not the same thing as an anxiety disorder, not the same thing as a mood disorder, but oftentimes these people will have this level of free-floating anxiety, scanning the room for threat, what do I need to be nervous about, that kind of, they often will have an anxious look on their face, tendency towards easy frustration, bitterness, tendency to experience these negative affects, including depression, may have some social anxiety, and may act on impulse. And then finally, this broad notion of general susceptibility to stress, sort of crashing, having these catastrophic reactions that can include suicidal ideation or just feeling generally overwhelmed and non-functional. We all know people like this in our lives. Sometimes we are worried that we might be like this, but this is oftentimes a personality approach that is enduring over time, definitely studied well, I think, in adolescence, early adulthood, and even middle adulthood, less so in later life. So thinking about depression being the relationship between depression and neuroticism. Neuroticism is related to depression, tendency to get a depressed mood or other negative affects, but not necessarily the same thing, sort of getting at this emotional reactivity. So I had somebody that worked with me who said, hey, can I do the NEO-PI, Neo Personality Inventory, on your depressed subjects for kicks? So sure. So we had this data that had been sitting around, and then we started doing, I had lived in the structural imaging world for forever, and then started to do some functional imaging. So the operative word here, because we're still thinking this is copied from the grant, the operative word here, words are 5 and 9. I got an R01 funded, N of 5 and N of 9, which is still amazing to me, that there appeared to be a there in terms of looking at neuroticism in these remitted depressed patients and controls, and looking at ventromedial prefrontal cortex, sort of where we think the sort of cognitive control action is, and that may affect hippocampus, amygdala, and other areas, and basically found the seed, reported it. So this was small pilot data. Interesting also, prefrontal cortex and amygdala, and this is eventually we turned this into a paper after we had sort of actually after having gotten the grant. We continued to follow folks, but basically found that controlling for baseline Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, or depression score, age and sex, each were associated with higher MADRS. So continuing to be depressed was associated with 3 measures of neuroticism. This total neuroticism score, negative affect, and vulnerability to stress. So again, not rocket science, but not before looked at in late life depression. Interestingly, since I've been, one of the areas of focus for me has always been cognitive decline. What about neuroticism? Neuroticism on the brain when you're older. Controlling for age, sex, baseline CIRAD score. So the CIRAD, again, Consortium to Establish Research Registry for Alzheimer's Disease. There was a CIRAD cognitive battery that came up with a total score and found that neuroticism is related to cognitive change as well. So 0.2, p-value of 0.29, 0.056 won't get you a paper, but it'll get you a grant. So just give me a little bit more, give me money for to study a few more people, and I can turn that frown upside down. I can make that 0.05. So that was interesting because this is, I think, the first time where because in middle age and younger folks, you would never think about looking at cognitive change in the context of a personality trait. But in older adults, you got to think about both mood outcomes and cognitive outcomes in depression. So that was interesting. And so looking, again, my usual shtick of following 2 cohorts, late life depressed and older adults without depression, but this time throwing in those with and without high neuroticism scores. And then getting these annual assessments. So from the pilot, again, looking at in analyses controlling for baseline cognitive score, we were able to turn that frown upside down. And in fact, we found that the vulnerability to stress domain within, or domain facet in my domain within the neuroticism facet was associated with baseline to 2-year change in cognition. This is too busy a slide, but this is sort of, I like to publish an initial methods paper. so I can refer to it, but these days you can't just get away with the methods. They want to see a little something. So, so we had, at that point, recruited 33 depressed, 27 non-neurotic controls, and then specifically to sort of had this 2x2 table of depressed, yes, no, high neuroticism, yes, no. We had to find people who were never depressed, yet scored high in neuroticism. So imagine the newspaper advertisement you would write to try to get these people. We pulled from the actual screener that we did, which is called the DS-14, that includes these negative affectivities. So, you know, it's like, you know, you always worry, da, 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 da. With that, we got a lot of people who were depressed, but we found, eventually we got about 12. In our pilot study at Duke, we said we'd have to actually do careful screening of about 500 healthy controls to get 20 highly neurotic, never depressed people. So we didn't make it that far, but we got enough to have some comparisons. So basically, you know, looking at depressed and controls, and particularly thinking about this, you know, we wanted it's interesting that in the depressed group, there are a lot of people when depressed will endorse a lot of the statements on this neuroticism questionnaire. And so that these neurotic folks and the depressed folks end up looking fairly similar on the neuroticism measure. So our treatment paradigm includes pharmacologic treatment. So as expected, people with neuroticism don't do as well over time with just pharmacologic treatment. And this is sort of acute treatment. And particularly those who score high in vulnerability to stress did not do well. And vulnerability to stress was related to remission or poor remission at 12 weeks. Very initial imaging results from ENVOLD. So I will say I'm not a tinkerer in the world of imaging like several of you are or aspire to be here. I'm a consumer of those data, but I can give a talk about it, and we'll see how well I do with it. The DS-14, as I mentioned, was a screener that we used that had social inhibition items, but also negative affectivity items. So as you think about what I'm about to show you, this is it. This is what we looked at in categorizing people. You get a continuous measure here, but it's obviously a very simple measure about often feeling sort of a tendency to be bummed out, right? Often down in the dumps, often make a fuss about unimportant things. I find myself worrying about something. I'm often irritated. I'm often in a bad mood. You can see that there's a range of normal and a range of, you know, if you endorse all of these, that may say something about you. So this is what we used initially. So we wanted to look at differences in people, how negative affect in controls and in depressed varied. Thinking that perhaps negative affect in people with depression versus people who are carrying around this negative affect without ever having been depressed, they may be two different animals and they may have two different brain correlates. So one of the things that we look at is amplitude of low frequency fluctuations, or ALF, as a measure of neuronal activity. And basically, bottom line is that with comparisons with these never depressed individuals, older depressed showed increased ALF in certain areas and decreased in other areas. So that's one. But particularly thinking about the that there may be differences in negative affectivity by brain region, and also thinking about from both a neuronal activity or ALF standpoint, but also thinking about functional connectivity. And so there were basically, in effect, changes. There were differences by group in ALF and negative affectivity measures in different regions of the brain. Some would amygdala, basal ganglia, so we're in the neighborhood. Also thinking about the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in this case also ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, insula, and amygdala. So there, it was interesting to us that there are these regions that pop up in depressed versus non-depressed, but also within depressed, there are these differences that you see based on negative affectivity. So that was interesting. We're particularly interested in areas of the brain that are opposite depending on group. So for example, an overlap so that amplitude of low frequency fluctuations was positively correlated with negative affectivity in the never depressed group, but negatively correlated with negative affectivity in the depressed group. And this was an area in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which sort of says, maybe there's something about this activity being higher in the never depressed yet neurotic group that may be a protective factor for ever getting depression in the first place. So part of this is this is sort of new data, trying to figure out what this means. But for us, trying to think about resiliency is another factor. People, older adults have lots of losses, have different things happen to them physically and in their lives. And how they deal with it may influence whether they get depressed or not, and and are there brain changes that are associated with a particular style that also may be protective as well. So despite a tendency to get stressed out, if certain parts of your brain are functioning a certain way, you may not get depressed. So again, a lot of data overload. Looking at the depressed group, many regions where connectivity, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex seed was correlated positive and negatively with NA. The depressed group showed a greater correlation between negative affectivity and functional connectivity in two regions connected to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex compared to never depressed subjects. So there is something about ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the importance in the intersection of depression and negative affectivity, and that's really not there in the non-depressed group. A little bit more of the busy slides. Regions in the depressed group where connectivity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex were related with negatively with NA, and then particularly one of the things that we were interested in is, the prefrontal cortex is obviously not monolithic. There are specific areas, but particularly wanting to look at differences in connectivity in dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Both showed greater correlation, functional connectivity in amygdala and middle temporal cortex, and lower correlation in the caudate, and that was not there. So that was one area where there were similarities in the dorsomedial and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So a summary. In terms of using ALF as a measure of neuronal activity, negative affectivity associated with that neuronal activity in different brain regions between depressed and never depressed, particularly in dorsomedial, ventromedial. In the never depressed group, higher NA was associated with increased affectivity of dorsomedial, decreased resting state in ventromedial and amygdala. By contrast, the higher NA in the depressed group was associated with increased resting activity in a different part of the brain. So again, thinking about never being depressed, but carrying around this tendency has one picture, and being older, has one picture in the brain, as opposed to this NA in the context of a depressive episode, brings in other parts of the brain in terms of connectivity patterns and neuronal activity. One of the take-home messages for us was that this increased rostral medial prefrontal cortex activity may be a marker of resilience to depression. That was something that we found in the never depressed group, higher activity than in the depressed group, and this decreased anterior ventromedial posterior cingulate amygdala activity may result from successful emotional regulation in never depressed group. So we published this and we said all this, but we're still trying to get our heads around all of this. This is sort of still for us hot off the press, and I'm glad to share it with you today. But this is a population that this has not been studied in before, and so we're excited about it and still trying to figure it out. Hopefully, we've been able to appreciate that depression indeed can increase risk of cognitive decline. It may represent a prodrome of dementia. Some may go on to Alzheimer's, others to vascular dementia. Clinically, memory impairment in the context of depression, particularly objectively measured memory impairment, is a bad prognostic sign. Neuroticism can accompany late life depression, can affect mood and cognitive outcome, and there may be different brain correlates in depressed and non-depressed older adults. And I appreciate your attention. That's what I do, in addition to managing a department, seeing a few patients. It keeps my life busy. But it was important to me, as I thought about taking on a chairman role, to be able to continue doing some research. And I've been very grateful that I've been able at the Center on Aging, where a lot of my research happens on the Storrs campus, to find the space and the infrastructure and a very willing partner, Dr. George Kushel, the director of the Center on Aging, would be very interested in working with you all. I know that Dr. Li-Hon Wong came and gave a talk here several weeks ago, and definitely I know a lot of you are focused on young people, particularly very young people, but really the action is in aging. So
there's more funding probably in aging also.
That's right. Well, with the Alzheimer's, again, thinking politically, this is a big push from Congress, and they have set aside a lot of money for funding of Alzheimer's research. I was in DC on Friday and chaired a study section, and they were, here's a bunch of grants. We want to throw money at it. It was quite something, and of varying quality. And so when they put, they have this money set aside, and we want you to focus on this, and people have sometimes very little turnaround time to get something in, and sometimes it shows because so you really try to pick out the best science, but there is a lot of money in clinical research related to Alzheimer's, obviously basic science as well. My studies sometimes have benefited if I put in the word Alzheimer's in my title. Sometimes, you're going to be eligible for that, even though it's primarily associated with depression. Alzheimer's is one of its potential outcomes. So sometimes you have to play that game as well. Yes, Jay.
So David, at the end term and all the way through, treating depression as a potential cause of cognitive decline. It seems to me that depression is actually a pretty rational response to cognitive decline. Like, and I'd say that somewhat jokingly because I'm looking down the precipice, but it's not joking because I see the impact. Like,
absolutely.
With a very old woman she's at, not only she's depressed, but her life is very limited because of decline in sensory, like cognitive and sensory decline, which I would find very depressing. So I guess, so how much of the arrow points in one direction versus?
Oh, right. So I would say we allow some degree of cognitive impairment to be allowed to get into the study. You can't have clinically diagnosable dementia, but I would say that for some people who come in with depression and memory complaint, part of that recognition that there may be something to worry about may be leading to that. And certainly clinically, outside of the study, sometimes people do have an appreciation for their cognitive weaknesses or changes, and sometimes people are blissfully ignorant. It is unfortunate that sometimes people, if they do appreciate it, then that depression, the depression is a consequence. And unfortunately, if that then turns into just not more than being bummed out about it, if you actually then developed a major depression and all these concentration difficulties, it makes your cognitive impairment dip that much more. So yeah, I said that late life depression research is deliciously messy. That's another aspect to it, because awareness of one's limitations, whether they be physical limitations of just sort of the aging process, or having had a stroke or something that causes physical impairment and limits your mobility, or the cognitive piece, can lead to depression, and that can just make everything that much worse.
Well, I'm depressed now because.
Oh, no.
I'm depressed because I discovered that I'm neurotic.
All right.
So
that only happened today?
It happens most days.
Okay.
I come to that realization. It's like a Groundhog Day thing. Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to ask a very naive question that's really focusing more on thing that I know you also referred to before, was actually the dementia.
Yep. Right.
Subsequent to depression or some of the other vascular.
Right.
So along the way, you talked about, for example, area of the brain that are thought to regulate, let's say, amygdala or whatever. So you talked about. So one level we talk about regulation as for example, well, I'm not really sure what you mean by regulation when you talk about regulation. So for a very cognitive person who cares about what may be going on in respect to, say, control, you may have a sort of cognitive definition of what regulation is.
Yes.
You may be regulating your attention and switching attention more or less effectively from one stimulus to another. You may be more flexible and so on and so forth. And we can use the term regulation in that way, or not quite as much. So I was just wondering if you would say a little bit more about
what I meant,
what you mean by regulation, but also then, some of these areas may be implicated within the cognitive literature, and I know you're not talking about the context generally, but specific parts of it. But let's take the prefrontal cortex. Some people think that's where memory for sort of more sort of schema-like things. So going to a restaurant, that kind of stuff, knowledge about the typical things that happen in typical circumstances, which, by the way, they break down in certain kinds of dementia. So I'm trying to see how these things link up,
Right.
if at all.
Right. So I think for me, I think regulation does refer to those cognitive processes, some flexibility. So, you know, something bad happens to me, my amygdala is like, keeps reminding me about, can I say, well, that's, yes, that was a bad thing that happened, but tomorrow is another day, or I can maybe focus on something else. But this happened to me before, and it wasn't the end of the world, and that kind of thing. That where we think that prefrontal cortex may sort of help pull in some of those memories, help you look at a problem in a different way. That there's actually a correlate there in terms. One of my colleagues at Duke looked at just whether distraction actually helps with moods. Is that basically the best strategy to use in older adults? And the answer is yes. If you can get, say, you're bummed, look at the bright shiny object over here, there's a way to redirect attention away and distraction techniques, and to some extent that's also wired in the brain. I think that can be helpful. So that's what I mean generally.
Reappraisal, glass half full.
So reappraisal, the older you are, the harder it is to conceptualize that, and the least effective that was in this one paper that she took the lead on and put together, because that's what we kind of look at, you know, classic sort of CBT kind of stuff. That may work for some adults, but for others, to get them out of a laboratory-based negative mood state, just redirecting and distracting probably were more effective. So
it's a bit like what we talked about when we looked at
yeah, right, exactly, right.
Any other questions? I have one more question that I'm dying to ask, if that's okay. Do you have more questions? I don't want to. It's okay. If you need to leave, please do leave. I know some people left already, but so you mentioned in the second to the last slide, resilience was related to the dorsal medial or rostral medial prefrontal cortex and so on. But I'm always curious, especially because a lot of the aging researchers think about these protective factors, resilience, brain reserve, and so on, how you or your field defines resilience that you used in there. And then also I feel like there's sometimes a confusion between protective factors and risk factors, and people use it as almost as a yin-yang sort of, where if you have high SES, it's a protective factor, but if you have low SES, it's a risk factor.
Right.
And then, but I feel like those should be two separate definitions, but people just take it as a seesaw sort of thing. But I just wanted your thoughts on this in your
Right. Yeah. So thank you for us. I think, or for me, in putting this together and working with Leon and others, I think for us, resilience was just resilience against getting depression. That's all. That's a shortcut word for basically they've lived their lives, had this stress, whatever, but this area of the brain seemed to be more active in the never depressed group, and so maybe that has something to do with it. And yeah, well, and you know, thinking about, you know, is then that activity, we're talking about high activity, low activity, is it? Yeah, so one wonders about yin-yang things as well, but that's what we meant by, in this case, just not getting depressed. The whole, you know, resilience is often in sometimes the eye of the beholder. Some of it is, you know, so what gets all into what is successful aging, and so part of that is, you know, a medical would be, well, disease-free, that kind of thing. If you ask a lot of people who've had major illnesses, say the fact that I'm still going shows that I'm resilient. So I think that the field is still trying to figure out what it means to have successful aging, to have resilience. Is that psychological resilience? Is it ability to ward off major physical illness, or more physical resilient kind of thing?
So typically, is it correct to say resilience and reserve is sort of a kind of a synonym, in the sense that assuming you have some biological vulnerability, whatever that biology is of developing Alzheimer's or whatever it is, then you have other kind of biological and cognitive factors that protects you from having that consequence. Is that resilience?
So, right. So one might say that the reserve may be an example, maybe a feeder of resilience. This is because the whole idea that you have, let's say if it's dealt a bad genetic hand and you're destined to get Alzheimer's disease, then anything that you can do or just have the good luck to have, not have a stroke, not have a head injury, not have perhaps episodes of major depression that are shrinking your hippocampus, all those things will contribute to a good cognitive reserve. You can be well educated. You could be lucky enough to be born with the right set of parents and their genetic predispositions, all that kind of stuff. Those may enable you to have been resilient in middle age. Something bad, you lose your parents, lose your dog, lose your whatever, and you get through it. And that maybe then you have maybe a marker of resilience that you also carry through in your toolkit as you get older. But the notion that you have cognitive reserve that may enable you to withstand the stresses of life, particularly in old age, may be linked to this notion of resilience as well.
Is that a hot topic in your area?
Yes. It's NIA is actually, the National Institute on Aging is very much interested in that and successful aging and how those, particularly if they're modifiable factors that can make you more resilient and therefore decrease the impact of the burden of these major illnesses.
I just want to make an observation, which is, I remember there was a time when I was a child when people demented, but the term Alzheimer's dementia wasn't so common. And I'm wondering whether a part of what's going on now, so here's a question, is this field of, let's call it loosely, aging or age-related cognition, whatever it is,
Yes.
do you view it as a young field? And could one view it as a young field because people are getting older? 50 years ago, the average age at which people died was X years younger, before the time at which one would see some of these things emerging, or the time at which we had to deal with these kinds of dementias, and they became almost a normal part of aging rather than atypical. They were typical rather than atypical. I don't know, what's your sense about that historically?
Right, so now I think part of it is before Alzheimer's was sort of this diagnosis of exclusion, I think we're much more better at saying it's actually a learning discipline for all of you interested in learning. It's actually an inability to learn new information. And so I think we can move much more to affirmatively giving a diagnosis as opposed to just a diagnosis of exclusion. That's happened in the last 15 to 20 years, which makes this young. The fact that now we have that and have a better sense of what the genetic risks are, and people are living long enough now where we can look and see, oh, well, maybe there are modifiable risks. There was one study in sort of a nice summary, actually, review in Lancet 2 years ago that said 35% of Alzheimer's disease may be preventable through lifestyle, medical, other types of interventions. If you can keep people from getting depressed and watching their risk factors for vascular disease and tell them to not smoke, and all of these things combined together may decrease the incidence of Alzheimer's by 30. So that's an exciting notion, and I think a lot of people are sort of reluctant to go into this because there's nothing you can do. I think we're getting to the point where, in fact, there are things that we can do. Eventually, we'll hit the holy grail of actually having sort of medications that modify disease, and so the name of the game will be earlier and earlier detection, which again will say, I think that will make create a lot of excitement when we can try to identify people and prevent what's a very devastating illness and very costly illness as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
appreciate it. Yes, know that sometimes they explode if I just take it out. So thank you for flying back, appreciate it.
Oh, thank you
And,
very much. This is great. Oh, we have some people calling in from the West Coast as well. I'm just